Samrat Samasdar, who is a clinical pharmacologist by training, and he also is very enthusiastic in the field of clinical research. He is also a prolific practitioner, medical practitioner, but his primary area of expertise is in clinical pharmacology. And as you know, drug development is a part and parcel, is a very core area in the discipline of clinical pharmacology. So let's now hear from Dr. Shambho Samrat Samasdar about the key issues in clinical drug development. When a new drug is developed, what are the steps, what are the challenges, and how they are actually planned. So now Dr. Shambho Samrat Samasdar will share with us. But again, I'll request Dr. Samasdar to be brief, if possible, to spend 30 minutes and then keep 10 minutes for discussion. Thank you. Over to Dr. Samasdar.
Thank you, sir. So today we will discuss about this important topic, that is clinical drug development. And very soon we are going to witness Olympic. I am afraid this is not a cartoon from Olympic, but this is a common perceptions regarding clinical trials, that the statisticians or their researchers are doing some manipulations with the results. So we already had covered the good clinical practice and related guidelines. So we know about the importance of data and ethics. So I think this cartoon is wrong. And now we'll move to the directly about clinical research and the different types of clinical research. And as we are going to discuss about clinical drug development, this is a experimental study. So how we can understand whether the study is experimental or observational, we need to ask this question, that did investigator assign exposures? So as an investigator, if I am assigning exposures, then it is an experimental study. And if it is not, then it is an observational study. So for today's discussion, we need to know about this experimental study, because all the clinical drug development pathway, they have to do the clinical trials, and that is the experimental study. Now the second question, if we ask whether there is allocation is random or not. If it is random allocation, so it is going to be a randomized control trial. If it is not, then it is non-randomized control trial. So we'll discuss different phases of clinical trial. For this time, I just want you all to remind that mostly the phase 2, phase 3 clinical trials, they are generally randomized control trial. The phase 1 clinical trial, they are in maximal case, they are non-randomized control trial. So what is clinical trial? As defined in the New Drug Clinical Trial Rule 2019, any systematic study of new drug or an investigational drug in humans to generate data for discovering or verifying its clinical pharmacological, that means including both pharmacodynamic and pharmacokinetic, or adverse effects, with the objective of determining the safety, efficacy, or tolerability. Now coming to the drug discovery and development process, as today we are going to discuss about clinical drug development. So what happened in the preclinical development, if we have some idea that can give us some better understanding. So the drug development starts from the target identification and validation. So we need to understand the target first. So let's take an example of a journey of a drugs which is used for type 2 diabetes, because type 2 diabetes is a pandemic epidemic now in India and all over the world, and India is going to be the capital, diabetic capital very soon. So when going to the pathophysiology of the diabetes, the researcher found one thing, that there is something known as incretin, which becomes deficient in diabetic individual. So they try to found something which can help to increase the incretin level. And for that, they found the target of DPP4. So that is an enzyme, that DPP4 enzyme break down the incretin. So now they try to found that whether they will get something which can block that DPP4 enzyme. And they did some assay, and ultimately lots of heat finding, and heat to lead means there are lots of things which can modulate that particular target area, that means DPP4 enzyme. And ultimately they found that respective DPP4 inhibitors, and then there is lead optimization, and ultimately some candidate selections. We know there are lots of DPP4 inhibitors now available in the market, but by this way the DPP4 inhibitors came into the market. But the thing is that we can see from this diagram the discovery tunnel. So initially, before heat to lead, there is more than thousands of compound, but after getting screened and screened, only from heat to lead, that is only the 100 compound. And after doing lead optimization, that can be at around 10 compounds, and ultimately the candidate seeking process, we get 1 or 1 to 3 compound. Then we will move on to the preclinical development before going to phase 1 clinical trial. So now the name, this preclinical, is little bit sometimes it is called as non-clinical studies, because even when the clinical trials started or ongoing, this type of non-clinical studies continued to see long-term adverse effects in the animals. So here it is mentioned as preclinical studies, but sometimes we can call it as, or maximum case nowadays we can call it as non-clinical studies. So non-clinical studies again can be divided into two broad groups. One is pharmacokinetic pharmacodynamic studies, by which we know about the pharmacokinetics, the absorption, distribution, metabolism and elimination, tissue distribution, and mechanistic studies. We understand the proof of concept in animals. Then moving to the safety studies, preclinical safety studies. So we need to do the safety pharmacology. Apart from that, there are some toxicology studies, including general toxicology, genetic toxicology, and other toxicity studies. So after this everything done, now we can move on to the clinical trial or phase 1 clinical trial. You can see from this timeline, it started when we are talking about that heat to lead optimization, candidate selection process. It took almost 2 to 10 years. Then the preclinical study testing, that also can take at around 4 years. After that, we move to the phase 1 clinical trial. But you know that very recently we got COVID-19 vaccine, and we got this by the virtue of compressed timeline. So there are many debates on that, whether we are compromising safety or not. But this is 2020, 2021. So we have advanced technologies that can replace these traditional pathways also. And also we need to give emphasis on that. Previously what happened, we have to wait till the preclinical testing completed before doing phase 1 clinical trial. But we can now continue, we can start phase 1 clinical trial also before ending all the preclinical testing. Obviously, after ensuring properly the safety of the patient, then only we can move on to the phase 1 clinical trial. So for phase 1 clinical trial, general contents at around 20 to 80 volunteers to determine the safety and dosage. Then comes the phase 2 clinical trial that includes 100 to 300 volunteers, mainly to monitor efficacy and side effects. And finally, the phase 3 clinical trial, which contains huge number of volunteers, 1,000 to 5,000 volunteers, mainly for understanding the efficacy, and apart from that, to know about the safety. So before phase 1 clinical trial, we call one drug as investigational new drug, and after it gets approval by the drug regulators, we call it as new drugs. So this is another area where we need to understand the success rate of clinical drug development. So one drug, after passing through the non-clinical testing, animal testing, entering into the phase 1 clinical trial, so there is chance of 10% success. This is very important because sometimes sometimes there is some queries regarding the cost or budget of one drug. We need to consider that for that 90% failure cases also, we also should take care that failure budgets to be included in one successful drug's journey. So that is very important to note. And apart from that, when one drug enters into the phase 1 clinical trial, there is a chance of 60%, 65% success that it can enters into the phase 2 trial. From phase 2 to phase 3, there is a 30% chance of success, but mostly the drugs which passes the phase 2, there is maximum chance to get the success, that is the 60% success in the phase that can pass to the phase 3. So this is the main objectives in phase 1. We generally see the safety, tolerability, and pharmacokinetics parameters. In phase 2, this is the trial phase where we understand the proof of concept, dose finding, dose ranging studies done, and also the pharmacokinetic, pharmacodynamic parameters we can know. And ultimately, by phase 3 clinical trials, we get the clinical efficacy data and safety outcomes. So again, in this diagram, it has been, we can note here that first of all, after doing the non-clinical studies, the IND application approved for testing in human by CLA, or we can say DCGI here. Then it will be tested in 20 to 100 participants. In the phase 1 clinical trial, main motto is to see the safety. Then it will pass to the phase 2 clinical trial, where we check the safety and dose finding. It is done at around on 200 to 400 participants. Then moving to phase 3 clinical trial to check the safety and efficacy. Here we take more patients. After getting this phase 3 clinical trial, the sponsors submit NDA to DCGI, and then DCGI review it. After that, DCGI gives permission, and then it comes into the market. After coming into the market also, there or approval of the drug, the regulators also give emphasis on different post-approval surveillance, and that is known as phase 4 studies. So we will basically discuss about the phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 clinical trial. As my topic is clinical drug development, pre-licensure period. So what is phase 1 clinical trial? It is for estimation of safety and tolerability. Generally, it has non-therapeutic objectives. So conducted in healthy subjects or certain types of patients. In case of if we are testing some cytotoxic drugs, so we need to include patients in those cases. Apart from that, if we go by the new drug clinical trial rule 2019, there they clearly mention preferably this type of study should be carried out by investigators trained in clinical pharmacology. And what is important, that is we should have access to the necessary facilities to closely observe and monitor the subjects. So that is very important. Next is so if we go by the objectives, generalized objectives of phase 1 clinical trial, so we need to find the maximum tolerated dose. It can be done by single ascending dose study or multiple dose ascending dose studies. Apart from that, the pharmacokinetics, pharmacodynamics parameters, and this is the first time when we get to know about the early drug activity concept. So proof of concept little bit we can understand from this trial also. But what is important now, it is not like that phase 1 clinical trial and after completing phase 1 clinical trial, we need to start phase 2 clinical trial. Even we can start phase 2 clinical trial, but side by side, we can continue phase 1 clinical trial also. And there are some different areas that can be studied by phase 1 clinical trial. So like is SAD or MAD, already we discussed, that is single ascending dose study, multiple ascending dose studies. There are some, I request Rohan to please remove that annotation, because there is some annotation that happened from Dr. Anil Kumar's side. So I request Rohan, are you there? Yeah, thank you. So there are some drug-drug interaction study, food effect study, relative bioavailability study, pharmacokinetic studies completely that can be done in ADM, like ADME studies in phase 1. Even when the phase 2 study started, we can continue that ADME study. Sometimes the QT toxicity studies that can be done in later phases. And the important is the special population studies. It is very important. Special populations means those are renal compromised, hepatic compromised, geriatric patient population. We can have those population studies in later phases after completing phase 2 clinical trial also. But that is the extended phase 1 clinical trial. And now coming to the phase 2 clinical trial. So first time here the drug is used in the intended patient population. So point of care or proof of concept is seen here. Next, it involves a small number of patients, but larger than phase 1 clinical trials. It includes 100 to 300 patients. Different doses are studied to find that this is dose finding studies. Generally, it has been done in parallel design, usually or better always to do placebo controlled phase 2 clinical trial. And we also need to see the actual drug effect at different doses. So this is the phase from where we understand the dose for the final phase 3 studies. Sometimes endpoints not always clinical. We need to take surrogate markers like blood pressure, serum cholesterol, BMD, sometimes infection cured in case of antibiotic studies. And also in phase 2 clinical trial, we should look at the pharmacokinetic pharmacodynamic correlations. So this should be a tightly controlled study, and there should not be any concomitant disease. What is the main purpose? Already we had discussed for phase 2 clinical trial, safety and tolerability. And this is the therapeutic exploratory study. This is not the confirmatory study. Now coming to the phase 3 clinical trial, which demonstrates the confirmation of therapeutic benefits. So this is therapeutic confirmatory studies. It confirmed the preliminary evidence that accumulated in phase 2 clinical trial that a drug is safe and effective for use in the intended indication and recipient population. Here we explore the dose-response relationships among dose, drug concentration in blood, and clinical response. And also we need to know the use of the drug in wider populations here, in different stages of disease, or the safety and efficacy of the drug in combination with other drugs also. Here we need to increase the external validity little bit compared to the phase 2 clinical trial. So in phase 2 clinical trial, there should be very high internal validity, but in phase 3 clinical trial, we can increase the external validity also. Now coming to the few important terminology that is mostly famous in US FDA, but also this is relevant in Indian settings nowadays. The fast track design, fast track development, drug development. So to facilitate the development and expedite the review of sorry, I was muted. So to facilitate the development and expedite the review of drugs to treat serious conditions that can feel unmet medical need, we can have this fast track development. And fast track designation must be requested by sponsor anytime during drug development process, and FDA decision taking within 60 days. So what does sponsor get extra if they get this fast track designation? So there will be more frequent meetings with FDA to discuss drug development plan and ensure collection of appropriate data that needed to support the drug approval. More frequent written communication from FDA, like the design of the proposed clinical trials, like using different biomarkers. Next is the eligibility for accelerated approval and priority review, if that relevant criteria are met. So that also sponsor will be informed about that. And also the rolling review that also can be done. And next concept is breakthrough therapy, to expedite the development and review of the drugs that intended to treat a serious condition, just like if you can assume like bronchogenic carcinoma, where preliminary clinical evidence indicates that the drug may demonstrate substantial improvement on a clinically significant endpoint that is equal to effect on irreversible morbidity or mortality, or on symptoms that representing serious consequence of the disease. So here, how does a sponsor get benefit? All fast track designation features, as we had mentioned previously, intensive guidance on an efficient drug development program that beginning as early as phase 1 trial, and FDA commitment involving senior managers. So designations to be requested by sponsors, ideally not later than end of phase 2. And here also the FDA should give response within 60 days. Now, accelerated approval. That means to approve drugs for serious conditions with an unmet medical need based on a surrogate endpoint. So what is surrogate endpoint? It is a marker, maybe some lab measurement or some radiographic image, or if sometimes a physical sign. So that is thought to predict clinical benefit, but it is not itself a measure of clinical benefit. So that type of surrogate endpoint can be used. And intermediate clinical endpoint, a measure of therapeutic effect that is considered reasonably likely to predict the clinical benefit of a drug. But for that also the phase 4 confirmatory studies required. Now coming to the priority review. So this is the prescribing drug use of following approval. So the 1992 rule. So they have a two-tiered review system. So there is some note on significant improvement in safety or effectiveness. Then there is a process of standard review, or there is a process of priority review. In case of standard review, the FDA should take action within 10 months. But for priority review, the FDA actions within 6 months. So scientific or medical standards for approval and quality of evidence needed remain the same as a standard review as with priority review. But communication of priority review designation to sponsor within 60 days of receipt of that new drug applications, or maybe the biologic applications. So this is, and now we all know about the importance of restricted use authorization. This is the, we can say, after this COVID-19 pandemic happens, we understand the need of this restricted use authorization or emergency use authorization. So that is again something advanced thing we got after this in the field of drug development after this pandemic. Now in this diagram, in a way we can understand how the phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 clinical trial happens. And the primary point is that IND submission. Then only one can do that phase 1 clinical trial. But as we had already mentioned, that it is not like that. We have to wait to complete phase 1 clinical trial to start phase 2 clinical trial. So this is not just a sequential thing. The phase 2 clinical trial can be started simultaneously with phase 1 clinical trial after getting some data which suggests this drug we can start phase 2 clinical trial, and we can convince our regulators and ethics committee. So this can be done, these studies can be done simultaneously. And we already had discussed about the importance of accelerated drug development program. Now coming to the last part of my talk, that is on the economics. Already my previous speakers has beautifully giving emphasis on ethics, good clinical practice. But as we all know that ethics is equal to multiplied product of 2M. So no, in that 2M, money is not there. It is the materialism and morality. So it is the product of both materialism and morality. So ethics is equal to materialism multiplied by morality. But in clinical drug development, economics or money playing a huge role. Because we can see here the total cost for bringing a new prescription drug to market is about $2 to $3 billion. And a significant portion of this cost is incurred in conducting clinical trials. So clinical drug development is generally hugely responsible for this cost. And the global clinical trials market size is expected to reach at around 70 billion by 2027, exhibiting a 5.1% compound annual growth rate during the forecast period. And why this is happening? Because the important driver for this growth is the increasing prevalence of chronic disease and conditions. And for that, we should have very easy clinical trial rules. And if we go back to history of our Indian scenario, between 2005 to 2009, clinical trial market in India witnessed an enormous growth after this passing of TRIPS in 2005. Lack of clear and stringent regulations and guidelines that lead to inadequate protection of the trial participants at that time, and that was a huge news in India. So during 2010-2013, several reports emerged about the falsification of trial data by investigators, the abuse of trial participants, the lack of informed consent from the participants, and the lack of adequate compensation to them. So there was a public interest litigation filed in 2012 by one NGO in the Supreme Court of India. And also the 59th report of the Parliamentary Standing Committee also noted these failings of the regulatory system of clinical trial. So there was some concerns about ethics, data quality, and lack of robust regulatory framework. And that causes a decline of the clinical trial market in India. Supreme Court directed the government to stop all clinical trials in country and amend the regulatory framework to ensure a foolproof system for the protection of the participants before any approval for a clinical trial was granted. So from 500 in 2010, the number of clinical trial application approvals dropped to 150 in 2014 and to a mere 81 by the end of 2015. And that is why in 2010, the reason behind that, there was in 2010, CDSCO had created a new entity named as New Drug Advisory Committee. So it generally prolonged the timelines even as long as 18 months for the approval of one clinical trial. So apart from that, the process was also unpredictable, and that causes a sharp decrease in clinical trial. Now, what happened in 2013-2014? Following recommendation by various stakeholders and the Professor Ranjit Rai Chaudhary Expert Committee, CDSCO brought in more changes. DCGI implemented a three-tiered regulatory process to review clinical trial applications. As per the new process, an application for approval was required to be submitted along with an executive summary to the DCGI, and there was an important role of subject expert committee who replaced that concept of NDAC. And approximately there was previously it was 25 subcommittees, all were abolished, and they gives the emphasis on independent ethics committee and institutional review board along with that particular approval. But because of the stricter rules and too many changes that lead to some confusion, the industry still did not show significant signs of revival. And that is why, to give a further boost to the industry, CDSCO once again revisited and revised the regulations. And the results of that is the New Drug Clinical Trial Rules 2019. So this is the new rule, which is the path of clinical drug development in India. So as we are moving, maybe 130 or 140 billions, 140 crores people Indians we have. So I think in this dense population, we have more diseases than any country. So this is very high time that we also require a very robust clinical drug development process in our country. So the road is very long to get a new medicine, but if we follow the ethical principles, the GCP, the guidelines, I think we can reach the goal. Thank you. Over to my professor, my mentor, Professor Shantanu Tripathi, sir. Sir, we cannot hear you.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Now we can hear you, sir.
Okay. Thank you very, very much, Dr. Shambo. This has been quite extensive and very informative. But then we have some members of the ethics committee who are actually from different other categories. So it